Hello and welcome to the Environmental News Network. We are filming from the lovely Constantia Valley with helicopters flying overhead, birds tweeting all around us, and I am basically going to cover some information that is deemed extremely important in terms of the environment, and it is actually extremely important. I mean, it's actually crazy important, but you sitting there in your house may or may not be aware of this. But it is actually so important that we've gone out of our way just to reiterate certain points of this. So the story actually starts a long time ago, but the part that I'm going to start with is the Great Barrier Reef, which was the first kind of point that it started becoming to everyone's attention. As some of you may or may not have heard, the Great Barrier Reef has been in slow decline over a period of time, and what is known as coral bleaching, which is basically this beautiful, lovely, luscious coral. It basically bleaches into this dull gray or dull white kind of shade due to lack of nutrients and ocean acidification. So a report was released roughly about 3 weeks ago, in which it's the most comprehensive study ever done on the reef, which they're saying that roughly 83% of the Great Barrier Reef is now dead. The question is whether or not, well, it's the top surface, remember that. The question is whether or not the Great Barrier Reef will be able to recover from such an event. And it is deemed extremely unlikely that the Great Barrier Reef is going to be able to recover. So as a result of this, people have taken some dramatic steps. They've basically gone and they're looking at doing things that neutralize the pH content of the top surface of the water in an attempt to basically remove the acidification problem that is causing the bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef. The problem really is, though, is that what's happening on the Great Barrier Reef is not a micro problem. So it's not a local problem. The problem that's happening on the Great Barrier Reef is actually a macro problem. And what that means is that there is no action that can be taken by any person in Australia, New Zealand, any of the surrounding islands. There is absolutely nothing that they can do about it, because what you are really witnessing is the impact of the macro event of climate change that is having a direct impact not only on the Great Barrier Reef, but on reefs all around the world. And what that means is that if you start looking at the kind of articles we've put out much news articles about this, that's been published rather widely, and there is kind of social activists that are trying to start campaigns, save the Great Barrier Reef, save the Great Barrier Reef, all over Facebook, Twitter, and various other groups. But the reality is that there is absolutely nothing that can be done to save the Great Barrier Reef, because it's a macro problem caused by overall climate change. So the thinking behind the Great Barrier Reef, if you understand that it is like the heart of the ocean. I mean, there nowhere else in the world is such a diverse, large kind of place in the ocean found with such a density of life. So in a way, it's like the heart of the ocean. When you and I don't know how old you are, where most of us, a lot of us were born, the Great Barrier Reef was an abundant, beautiful place. And inside of our time, we're actually going to see the death of the heart of the ocean. And, no social activism is going to stop it. The only thing that is going to stop it is if we eventually kind of move away from this idea of climate change. But bearing in mind that 83% of the reef is already dead, the probability of us being able to stop it is almost zero. So then, sorry, I've just been corrected. It was 93% of the reef is dead. That's actually right. So then it brings us to another component. So now take that story and throw that story on one side of your mind, okay? And then it comes to another part of the story. Now they were looking, a study was recently done on what is causing ocean acidification. But while they were studying that, they were looking at oxygen levels inside of the ocean. Now there is a relationship between the volume of plankton that is present in the water and their ability to sequester carbon dioxide. The ocean, despite what you may have heard, is actually the largest sequesterer of carbon dioxide. And when I say sequester, I mean that it takes in carbon dioxide and releases oxygen. So the ocean is actually the largest, what we call a carbon sink. So it's bigger than the rainforest, bigger than any other arboreal forest. It's bigger than anything that we have done. The ocean actually does most of the work. So most of the oxygen that you're breathing comes from the ocean. I'm going to come to that point in a little bit. I'm just going to explain a bit about the dynamics of what's happening in the ocean. So basically, plankton are responsible for bringing oxygen from the surface of the water, bringing carbon dioxide from the surface of the water, and they harness that as they keep the carbon, they release the oxygen. But because the top surface of the water has been heated, because of the amount of sunlight that is impacting on the ocean, the plankton are no longer able to reach the top surface of the water, and thus, even though they are still filtering some carbon dioxide that is resident, because that's what acidification is, it's an increase in carbon dioxide, it's mainly carbon that they're picking up, and there's less oxygen going around the ocean. So the report came out that basically said by 2030, you would start to see off all shores, or you would start to see obvious signs of lack of oxygen inside of the water. And there's another report that came out, but it's kind of minor by comparison, but it's still significantly important, is that the plankton is responsible for bringing that oxygen right from the top surface levels right to all the levels going down the marine chain as far as it can. And what this does is it enables a healthy marine environment where creatures are of all different kind of levels in the ocean are capable of eating or breathing. So with the loss of oxygen in the water, with the reduction in oxygen in the water, and with the growing kind of losses of oxygen in the water, the impact on marine life is projected to be devastating. Devastating. So what you're talking about is the loss of massive marine chains. So where you and I now can walk into the store and pick up like fish, a large proportion of those fish are they're dying. They're dying. So because they're just dying of suffocation, there is nothing for them to actually breathe. So the impacts, the knock-on effect impacts that this has is dramatic. So now if you take that and put that in the side as well, along with our little story about the Great Barrier Reef, what you're left with is an interesting little study that's been done, and something that we've actually here at Brave Green World, we've been monitoring for quite some time. In fact, it was a question that was raised a while back. When you were in school, you got taught, so you said, like, how much oxygen is actually in the atmosphere, okay? So the common phrase that we throw around is 21%. 21% of oxygen is available in the atmosphere, which means that for every breath that you take, you're taking in some helium, some argon, some oxygen, but of that, 21% is actually oxygen. Now, if you understand the fundamentals of climate change, what they're saying is that there's an increase in carbon dioxide. So from combustion, like we're burning carbon, from kind of, exhaust, carbon monoxide. So from all of these things, there is a combustion process that's taking. It's what's called oxidization, which means that in order to release carbon in the form of smoke or byproduct, it has to attach itself to an oxygen so that it becomes lighter and it floats up. So that's how you get carbon dioxide, which means that there's a direct mathematical relationship between the volume of carbon dioxide versus the volume of oxygen. So some studies were done about this, because what we wanted to find out was, what is the actual oxygen? You can't have an increase in carbon dioxide without having a corresponding decrease in oxygen. So we wanted to see what studies were done in relation to the amount of atmospheric oxygen that's available. And so far, the results are kind of sketchy. Scientists actually blatantly stated in the document that they just don't know. So they've done some recordings. Some cities, they've picked up oxygen contents as low as 14%, some as low as 17%. And these are just patches. If you imagine patches floating around above cities that are deoxygenated. And now you can see it all starts to make sense. Inside of your ocean, you're now getting patches of loss of oxygen. Inside of your atmosphere, you're getting loss of oxygen. And those same losses of oxygen are starting to have an impact on the marine ecosystem, which is in turn having an impact on what you're seeing in the Great Barrier Reef. And so, for the first time, actually, all the little pieces of a puzzle are starting to coalesce into one big story. And that story is happening right now. Right now, as I say this, it's happening. And what are you and I really capable of doing about it? Nothing. What are you and I capable of bringing about some kind of change that will affect it? We are powerful, but this has got to be bigger than some social media campaign. This has got to be a fundamental change in the way that we're going about doing business. What it means is that there's greater level of sunlight that is hitting the ocean. The ocean is absorbing more heat because all it is really energy transfer. So there is more energy inside of our atmospheric system than there is outside of our atmospheric system. And what that does is it starts to heat up the top surface of the water. And because the top surface of water begins to heat up, what it really does is anything. It's the same thing that happens with any water. If you heat up water, it expands. As there's more energy absorbed by the ocean, there's lower oxygen inside of the ocean. There's greater ocean acidification, which is reducing plankton. And ultimately, it is now starting to have an impact not only on marine-based kind of oxygen levels, but also on atmospheric-based oxygen levels. And this is a story that is actually more serious than anything you're going to hear. You know, it's more serious than anything that you're going to read. It's more serious than anything that you're actually going to uncover this week. And you know, you can put it in your head, you can do what you like with it. But the fact is that if you take a look, and I'm just going to reiterate why ENN is actually important. If you look at what the news was covering inside of this week, we covered things on CNN like Trump. We covered a whole lot of rubbish that's related to events on the field. But why is nobody talking about this? Because this, in your lifetime, no longer is it 2100, the fame, this is when we'll see the effects of climate change. We're talking something that is only 14 years away before you are going to see significant changes in the oxygen content of the surface of the ocean, and thus it's going to impact those that eat seafood. It's going to impact the entire marine chain, and it's going to impact oxygen levels. And when scientists were asked, what happens if the oxygen levels get to a low point? What is the net effect? What is the safety level for human beings? You know what they said? They don't know. They don't know. Now think about that. Just put that in the back of your head. Remember, for all of you that are going to be watching Donald Trump go on and attack Hillary Clinton, and you're going to watch Bernie Sanders try climb all over Clinton, and how important that is, the reality is that day by day, the oxygen content of this atmosphere that you're relying on to watch those things is actually running out. So I want to thank you for your time in watching ENN. Remember that this is the channel that is going to bring you actual news, real news that's actually important to you and actually has meaning to not only you but everybody else on Earth. ENN is the one channel where you're going to actually find out the things that are important. So thank you for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.
When I start these presentations and I'm talking to police colleagues at Interpol, I usually leave the F word out until the last thing, because they don't understand the F word. So I start by describing the type of organised crime network, and it will be a network with beneficial owners in Europe, potentially Spain. They're insurers of that business in the UK, for example, the banks in Central Europe, the incorporated companies in Central America or offshore tax jurisdictions. The business is supported by labour from Indonesia. They conduct their outputs from their business activities, exported into Southeast Asian countries. The officers of the company come from countries such as Spain, Chile, Portugal, Peru, Ukraine, and their markets are in Thailand, Vietnam, China, and the US. And then you ask them, what do you think I'm talking about? And when you say fish, they go, what? Okay. It's a job to convince police. Now, Interpol's, what Interpol depends on is the National Central Bureau point of contact. The National Central Bureau point of contact needs to establish relationships with all the national law enforcement agencies who are dealing with this area. And quite frequently, many of those agencies have never sat down together and talked. So we call that an environmental security seminar with a fisheries focus. So the fisheries crime types are quite simply, we've heard a list on several occasions. I'm going to give you some real examples from the Antarctic operations. These operations have been being conducted for over 2 years, nearly 2 years now, with a number of groups of countries exchanging intelligence and information, which came to a bit of a head when Sea Shepherd started chasing the Thunder. The standard crime types are, of course, abuse of the registries, we've heard from Nigeria, customs frauds, financial frauds, insurance frauds, breaches of national, administrative and criminal law, and breaches of national law by nationals. That's important, although I'm talking about toothfish, what's the connection to Africa? Well, the connection to Africa is that the registries of Equatorial Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Nigeria were abused. The criminals are very clever. They know where these weaknesses are, and one key thing that protects them is that we don't communicate with each other effectively over law enforcement. That's their key advantage. The modus operandi is frequent changes of name and identity, changes of ownership, the national registry abuses, the gaps, exploiting the gaps, for example, in the Nigerian fisheries legislation, and the lack of effective monitoring capability if a vessel never goes to your port. Licensing abuses, many examples of fraudulent licenses I've come across. Duncan's mentioned those. I've worked with Duncan for a few years when I was in the UK, and the ease with which licenses can be forged is it's very easy, and it's difficult to provide documents that can be verified. And there's another key issue. If your documents are presented to you in a port, how do you verify that with the country who issued them? So these are the 6 vessels. 5 of them have purple notices on them. The Thunder